Jordan.
Do you know any of the cast members?
Oh gosh, I don't. That was very good.
I've seen that before.
Wow. No, I know. We agree on that regard.
We agree that the music is good.
Disagree. The love music at the end of all three of them. First act.
And the funeral.
The funeral music is great.
Plot.
You don't like the plots. I enjoy it because it's a family drama. Think about it. The relationship between Frick and Rohan. I think it's quite good.
I'm taking a course in Greek and Roman mythology. So
It's so crucial. I know. Cosmic gods are not like us. Who is Gaia and Oranos, whereas Zeus and all the rest of them are human-like.
yeah,
So, yeah, and it's so fascinating. Just like when someone once said about We'll talk. Good morning, everybody. Shabbat Shalom to everybody. So, some of you know that Apollo's Fire is going to be doing a concert here on Saturday, February 25th. No, that's not right. Thursday, March 9th, here at the Cleveland Museum of Art. On Tuesday, April the 4th, the program has the title Exile and Resilience, Music of the Jewish and African Diasporas. And the reason I mention it is not only for its own sake, but also because I've invited Jeanette and Jeffrey Strauss and a couple of other people to come here next week after Torah Study to give us a little preview and demonstration. So here's what it is. So Jeanette Sorrell and Jeffrey and a couple of other people will talk about this concert program and will perform 2 short excerpts. Jeanette designed the program drawing on inspiration from her family's experience of exile and separation following World War II. The new program will be performed by the Full Apollo's Fire Troupe, 24 musicians, at the Temple-Tifereth Israel on Thursday, March 9th, the Cleveland Museum of Art on Tuesday, April 4th. And then it says the program will also tour to New York at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Chicago, San Francisco, Stanford University, London, Heidelberg Spring Festival in Germany. But you can catch it right at the Temple-Tifereth Israel. So the plan next week will be for us to have a regular Torah study until 10:40, something like that. We'll break for a few minutes, and then I'll turn it over to Jeanette and Jeffrey, and they will present for maybe a half an hour. Okay?
Rabbi,
So
where
it's
are tickets available?
I don't know the answer to that. Call or look. Yeah, go to Apollo's Fire online. I've ordered tickets that way. I think you can call the box office too, but that's probably the easiest. Okay. Stuart.
I believe that the program is being videotaped to be presented on a web service.
Oh, good. Okay.
Which one?
So the concert itself
Yes.
is being videotaped. Great. Okay. We'll get more information on that, I'm sure. Okay. Well, I want to welcome those who are live streaming. We're glad to have you as well. So let's continue with our blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us with God's commandments, enjoining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. Okay, so we have arrived now at one of the climaxes of biblical literature, maybe the climax in the sense that everything leads up to it, and from it emerges the entire history to follow, at least in terms of its normative interest. That is, whether or not the people are obeying what they have learned on Mount Sinai, and everything comes to depend on that. Okay? So in this sense, Mount Sinai is absolutely pivotal. So here we are at Exodus chapter 19, and what I want to do is read a little bit from Nahum Sarna's great commentary in the Jewish Publication Society series. 5 volumes, and I appeal to it all the time. So, Sarna says here, the arrival at Sinai inaugurates the culminating stage in the process of forging Israel's national identity and spiritual destiny. The shared experience of bondage and liberation are to be supplemented and given ultimate meaning by a great communal encounter with God. That's an interesting point, isn't it? The community experienced slavery. The community now has this encounter with God. Henceforth, Israel, and by Israel you see what Sarna means, not the land of Israel, the state of Israel, not Jacob, who's also Israel, but the people, the Israelites. Henceforth, Israel is to be a people inextricably bound to God by a covenantal relationship. The Hebrew term for covenant, brit, is the seminal word brit. The Christian designation of sacred scripture as testament, Old Testament, New Testament, reflects this understanding of the covenant concept as the controlling idea of biblical faith. Testament is now a largely obsolete word for the written record of a compact. Okay? So Sarna is making the point here that the word testament points to what he is calling the controlling idea of biblical faith. And see, that's a very interesting question in and of itself. Is there a unity to the Bible? Does the Bible have controlling issues from beginning to end? And that's a controversial idea in scholarship. Sarna is suggesting covenant, brit, is at least one of them. He says I think I'd prefer to go with one of them. In the ancient world, relationships between individuals as well as between states were ordered and regulated by means of covenants or treaties. Numerous examples of such instruments of international diplomacy have survived between and among states. That's what he means by international diplomacy. deriving from various parts of the ancient Near East. So what Sarn is pointing out here is that the biblical concept of covenant has an ancient Near Eastern background. That is, the Bible didn't emerge in a vacuum, even though it transformed, as we'll see, many of the concepts and ideas that it inherited. Think of the Noah story. The Noah story is about values. Noah walked with God. Others did not, hence the flood. In the ancient Gilgamesh epic, the analog to Noah is searching for immortality. So the Bible knows the story of the flood and yet transforms it according to its own interests. So, back a bit. Numerous examples of such instruments of international diplomacy have survived, deriving from various parts of the ancient Near East. These divide into two basic categories: a parity treatment, P-A-R-I-T-Y, where the contracting parties negotiate as equals, and a suzerain vassal treaty, where one party transparently imposes its will on the other. A study of these documents, particularly those of the latter type, leaves no doubt as to the influence of the ancient Near Eastern treaty patterns on the external, formal, literary aspects of the biblical notion of covenant. External, formal, literary. Okay, so he's going to contrast those commonalities with some of the uniquenesses of biblical understanding. The affinities, he goes on to say, are to be expected. In order for the Brit to be intelligible to the Israelites, it made sense to structure it according to the accepted patterns of the then universally recognized legal instruments. In other words, why write a text like the Bible so that the recipients don't understand it? But if you speak the language of the day around the ancient Near East, people can understand both the basic patterns and the distinctiveness of the biblical model. Okay. So he goes on to say this: the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, and its contents are, however, in a class by themselves. You get what he's driving at here? General patterns of which the biblical notion of covenant is a part, because the biblical authors understand the ancient Near Eastern background. It emerges in that background. And yet, for all the commonalities, the Bible is distinct in particular ways. By the way, I don't think this means that other particular understandings of covenant around the ancient Near East are not also distinct in their ways, right? He's not trying to say that we have two models here: the distinctiveness of the biblical model and the way everybody else does it. Everybody else may do it in their own particular ways as well. He's now interested in the distinctiveness of the biblical pattern over and against the common model. The idea of a covenantal relationship between God and the entire people is unparalleled. Similarly unique is the setting of the covenant in a narrative context. It is the latter, the narrative, that imparts to the covenant its meaning and its significance. The covenant would be devalued were the link between them to be severed. Now this, I think, is a very profound point, because the Ten Commandments, the revelation on Mount Sinai, is embedded in an ongoing narrative. Story leads to it, story leads from it. So that the fulcrum here is this revelation. led to by the story from the patriarchs who finally end up in Egypt, the slavery, and the need for liberation in two senses, physical and spiritual, which is then given climax in this revelation. Also, as I pointed out a few minutes ago, it's precisely law and institution and leadership models that contextualize the narrative of the future, its successes and its failures, okay? So that not only does he just make the obvious point that the revelation is nested in narrative, but it's crucially nested in narrative. The Torah is necessary. The narrative makes that obvious. And the whole shape and normative understanding of the future is given its definition by the covenant itself. This is a very important point. So let me go back to the beginning of this paragraph because I think this is a very, very rich understanding. The Decalogue and its contents, however, in a class by themselves, the idea of a covenantal relationship between God and an entire people, however, is unparalleled. Similarly unique is the setting of covenant in a narrative context. It's the latter that imparts to the covenant its meaning and significance. The covenant would be devalued were the link between them to be severed. Another major and original feature is the manner in which the content of the covenant embraces the internal life of the vassal, the Israelites, by regulating individual behavior and human relationships. Such a preoccupation with social affairs is beyond the scope and intent of all other ancient treaties, whose sole concern is with the external affairs of the vassal in relationship to the sovereign. The uniqueness of the Decalogue notwithstanding, it is undeniable that many of its provisions are closely paralleled in the wisdom and ethical literature of the ancient world. Several other ancient law collections rest upon foundations of ethical and moral principles of justice and morality. How could they not? Sins of a moral and ethical nature, such as bearing false witness, disrespect of parents, theft, adultery, and murder, are all listed in the magic texts from Mesopotamia known as the Shurpur series. The Declaration of Innocence, I guess that's another, or a part of another document, located in chapter 125 of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, is formulated in negative terms, like so many of the Ten Commandments, and clearly testifies to the reality of positive moral ideals. It is obvious that the great civilizations of the Nile and Mesopotamian valleys could not have functioned without a commitment to a set of ethical ideals and principles of morality. Okay? So this is once again an element of his major theme, commonalities and differences. It's improbable that other civilizations and their documents would not try to regulate some of these behaviors. Then he goes on to say, but what is revolutionary? See, this is commonalities and now differences. What is revolutionary about the Decalogue in Israel is not so much its content as the way in which these norms of conduct are regarded as being expressions of divine will. Okay? So in the Hammurabi Code, there are lots of laws, but they're all promulgated by Hammurabi. So let me go back to that. What is revolutionary about the Decalogue in Israel is not so much its content as the way in which these norms of content are regarded as being expressions of divine will. eternally binding on the individual and on society as a whole, eternally binding. Both are equally answerable, individual and society. Both are equally answerable to the deity, which was not the case in pagan cultures. Another extraordinary Israelite innovation is the amalgamation of what in modern times would be classified separately as religious and secular or social, obligations. This distinction is meaningless in a biblical context, where both categories alike are accepted as emanating from God. Social concern, therefore, is rooted in the religious conscience. That's very powerful. You think of the Ten Commandments and divide them into 5 and 5. We could say broadly that the first 5 are our relationship to God, and the second, our relationship to one another. It's not accidental that the religious commandments come first, because they serve as the ground, the necessary ground, for the ethical commandments to follow. In other words, the vertical among us is grounded in the horizontal, our relationship to God. In like manner, one could say, one of the main goals of the religious commandments is to regulate social relations. So the religious commandments are a necessary foundation, but their telos, their goal, is to regulate society, which is to be understood in a religious context, in the sense that the force of those social relationships is grounded in our faithfulness to God. I've said over and over again all these years, something that I learned from one of my professors at rabbinical school. And he said it this way. You'll remember I've said this, some of you. If you want to love your neighbor, begin by loving God. If you start by loving your neighbor, you will end up hating him. We are not often lovely beings, right? And my neighbor can give me a lot of trouble and cause me to diminish my regard for him or her. If I begin by loving God, and one of the implications of loving God, that we are made in the image of God, I'm likely all the more not to give up on my neighbor. So I think what this teacher of mine said was something about the structure of the Ten Commandments. First, the religious commandments, which give the ground for the power, the durability of social commandments, which are, almost by definition, fragile. I mean, when Thomas Hobbes, that the state of nature is the state of war of all against all. What is Hobbes talking about? He's talking about the problems that reside in the human breast of all of us that pit us against one another often. And so when Hobbes talks about the necessity of a social contract, he's not saying that the impulses at the root of the war of all against all go away. The contract is just an attempt to regulate them. This is why Hobbes, and not Locke, moves from the social contract to the need for an absolute monarch. So for Hobbes, the contract can never be abrogated. You may remember John Locke, the contract which was formulated by individuals can be abrogated and give justification for revolution. Hobbes was much more worried about human nature and its persistences than Locke was. So, it's something to be reckoned with, that somehow a connection to something eternal God, values, however you want to put it, becomes a condition for the ongoing regulation of social relations. It's a provocative idea. I'm not going so far as to say it's the only way of doing it. Obviously, since the Enlightenment, I've just mentioned Hobbes and Locke, thinkers have tried to regulate social relationships in a secular fashion. Whether or not they've succeeded is another question. Okay? So let's go back here. Social concern, just to repeat the last sentence of this paragraph, therefore, is rooted in the religious context. Now, and the point that I've tried to make here, in Sarna's name, is that the very structure of the Ten Commandments is powerful in itself, aside from the various commandments themselves, which are to some degree common throughout the ancient Near East world. Let's continue just a little bit more. Still another outstanding feature of the Decalogue is the apodictic nature of its stipulations, what Kant called a categorical imperative. Do this, don't do that, as opposed to the contrary, hypothetical imperatives. If certain things take place, if you want a certain kind of thing, then do X. If X, then Y. I do Y only because the situation calls for it. A categorical imperative is of the form, not if X, then Y, but of the form, do Y in all circumstances. And that's what apodictic means, categorical. Still another outstanding feature of the Decalogue is the apodictic nature of its stipulations. The simple, absolute, positive, and negative imperatives are devoid of qualification and mostly presented without accompanying penalties or threats of punishment. It's another interesting feature of the Ten Commandments. There is something of consequences in the parents' commandment. If you want to honor your mother and father, so your life shall be long on the land which the Lord your God gives you. So that's a consequence of honor at home. But by and large, punishments or rewards are not a part of this. And Sarna goes on to say something about that. The idea is that the covenant is a self-enforcing document. The motivation for fulfilling its stipulations is not to be fear of retribution, but the desire to conform to the divine will. That's a powerful idea, isn't it? Reinforced by the spiritual discipline and moral fiber of the individual. Okay. Scott?
I disagree with that one statement there, because at the end of this chapter, there are consequences specifically said. I will visit Gil upon the generations to come. I will extend kindness to the generations to come. So it's kind of a reward-punishment thing there, isn't it?
So the key word here is the word mostly. Right? Let me read it again. The simple, absolute, positive, and negative imperatives are devoid of qualification and mostly present. Okay, very good. So, and there's a little footnote here. Many, many years after I write this, Scott Root is going to raise a question, and I wasn't going to put mostly in there, but I decided to. That's footnote 850. Okay. Very good. Okay. So, comments, questions about what we've looked at so far? It's rich stuff, isn't it? Okay. Yeah, Ron.
Mouthful of bagel. You mentioned Hobbes.
Yeah.
His contemporary, Spinoza,
Okay.
was an atheist.
I'll go with you for a minute.
How did Spinoza reconcile his beliefs with this concept of first the religion, the deity,
Yeah,
then the social structure.
right, right. I've got two answers to this question. The first one is, I don't know. That's not going to keep me from the second answer, though. Yeah. Look, I mean, I think who was it? I think it was the poet Novalis, one of the Romantics, who said that Spinoza was a God-intoxicated individual. Spinoza has a very rich understanding of the love of God. But for Spinoza, in a famous Latin phrase, Deus sive natura, something like that, God or nature. So Spinoza's God is immanent, not I-M-M-I-N, which is about time, but I-M-M-A-N, which is about space. Spinoza's God is not far away. Spinoza's God is very near. As a matter of fact, God equals nature. So we discover our imperatives through the exploration of nature, the way it works and its consequences. So in this sense, Spinoza is a thoroughgoing pantheist. When scientists study the ways and the laws of nature, they're also exploring God. Now, there is a question about whether Spinoza's God is a creator or not. What's the idea here? Deus naturans, Deus naturata. Deus, God as the condition of nature, or God as naturing. And I think that's a question in Spinoza's scholarship, which I haven't looked into for a long, long time. So I don't know exactly what Spinoza would say about all of this. His method is a geometrical method. If you look at his ethics, it all is written as a geometrical argument with premises and corollaries and theorem 1 and extension 2 and so on. So Spinoza is trying to argue through the prestige and the consequences of something that was highly regarded in that day, a Descartes' approach to nature. So what his political philosophy is, he wrote another book, what is it called? The Tractatus, the theological, political Tractatus, that's what it is, in which he deals with, he's one of the founders in that book of biblical criticism. Spinoza is one of the founders of the entire school, along with Hobbes. Hobbes was another one. So you can see that my second response is a way of circling around my first one. And I don't know. But Spinoza is such a fascinating figure. One of the truly innovative figures in the history of ideas. Yeah, he was excommunicated. He didn't care. We think of Spinoza as the first secular Jew. He did not do what lots of people in that era did. If they were to leave Judaism, they joined Christianity. Your alternative to Judaism was Christianity. Spinoza said, I'm leaving Judaism, but I'm not joining Christianity, although he had plenty of Christian friends. Jim?
Well, in general, we're talking about social order and to minimize the chaos. So prior to Mount Sinai, or maybe prior to that, the social order was controlled by dictators like Pharaoh or chieftains in a more chaotic setting or whatever. And all of a sudden, instead of everybody trying to please the gods, now they're using the gods as, God told me to do it.
Yes.
So now it's another attempt at controlling the masses. And in doing that, I think you inject morality. Well, I know you do, because for all religions' faults, the chaos would be infinitely worse without it.
That's a good point.
So I think it changed the attempt to have some kind of order so we could progress as a society.
No, I think it's a good point. And one could, in a way, articulate a kind of paradox that by giving us commandments, there is an attempt, let's call it by the biblical guide, to control us. But when you give somebody a commandment, and one of the conditions for the possibility of fulfilling a commandment is free will. I only command those who can respond yes or no. So the very attempt to control us is also an attempt to liberate us, to give our free will a chance to shape our lives as we want to. And of course, it's not just binary. Either I obey it or I don't, because inevitably interpretation is going to arise. And interpretation will give me different ways of obeying it. So it's not just my free will is limited to yes or no. My free will is also given some free rein to understand the circumstances in which this commandment is given, and there's always changing circumstances. The ambiguities in the text, honor your father and your mother. Well, let's suppose my father tells me to go rob a bank. Am I obligated to honor my father in a mechanical way? Or is my obligation to ask myself, what is the joint imperative that relates my father and me to an imperative? My father has an obligation not to rob a bank. And therefore, the higher way to honor my father is not to rob the bank on the assumption that he is violating a commandment, and by not doing it, I might educate him in some way or another. So the commandments don't come automatic. They're not algorithmic, right? In the sense that you have a commandment and you can grind out what I'm supposed to do. That's what an algorithm is, right? It's a decision procedure to get to a particular decision. The commandments are much more nuanced than that. Don't take the name of the Lord your God's name. Don't take the name in vain. Honor the Sabbath to keep it holy. Okay, well, now what should I do now? The Karaites, a very important 1,000-year kind of a sidebar of the Jewish tradition, took the biblical language literally of not going outside of our homes. And therefore, their understanding of keeping Shabbat was to stay at home. I mean, it's precisely so that I can relate to others at shul, for lunch, and so on, that the Sabbath gives an opportunity for. So how am I supposed to understand that commandment? Don't steal. Well, anybody in the ancient world think about intellectual property? So that the commandments liberate, they control, but they liberate in two ways. I can obey it or not, or I can wonder just what does it mean to obey it in dynamic circumstances. Okay, so, the difference between Pharaoh and God is that for Pharaoh, our obligations, like the pagan gods, is to serve them. That's why in the Enuma Elish, for example, the Babylonian creation story, the gods create human beings out of the blood of a defeated warrior. And they created human beings just because they got tired of trying to find their own food. So that our role can be simply stated, serve the gods. That's just what you said. The difference between Pharaoh, for whom his subjects are there to serve him only, God is trying to get us to rise to our stature as human beings. God is commanding, we reach to God in order to find a way to reach back down to earth and live fuller lives. It's not about merely serving God. We serve God by serving one another, as well as serving God. There are religious commandments, but there are also social commandments, which, as Sarna points out, are grounded in some belief in God. It's a very powerful idea, isn't it? I must confess that I've spent much of my own life trying to buy into that whole schema, which, over the years, it's begun to take. Because I was not raised in a religious home, but I had a certain yearning for something. And one of the great things about my profession is it gives us a chance to spend a lifetime trying to accept the power of a certain framework, which is hard for secular-minded people to do. And I'm as secular-minded as anybody, but I'm trying also to do something else. So let's turn to the book of Exodus chapter 19, which is where we find ourselves. So, on the third new moon, after the Israelites had gone forth from the land of Egypt, so the third new moon would be the month now Sivan. They leave in Nisan, then the month of Iyar, now Sivan. So according to the calendar, we are now the first day of the month of Sivan. Shavuot is celebrated on the sixth day. On the third new moon, after the Israelites had gone forth from the land of Egypt, on that very day, they entered the wilderness of Sinai. Having journeyed from Rephidim, they entered the wilderness of Sinai and encamped in the wilderness. Israel encamped there in front of the mountain. And Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and declare to the children of Israel." Those are synonyms, right? The house of Jacob, the children of Israel. Because Jacob's name was changed. Well, he added another name, Israel. He never lost the name Jacob, but now he's known by two names. "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to me." Okay? So this whole notion of eagle's wings, I should go back to Sarna for a minute, is also very rich. Here's what Sarna says on eagle's wings. "The king of birds, the eagle, impressed the biblical writers for the prodigious expanse of its outstretched wings, its solicitous and protective carrying of its young on its back, and its ability to soar to great heights at considerable speed and to fly over long distances." So identifying the bird as the kind of the metaphor for God's carrying us through the wilderness is not accidental. You think of this idea of a bird carrying its young, not in its claws, which makes it vulnerable to arrows from below, but on its back, so that if those arrows are shot at the eagle, it's the eagle that suffers the blow. So the eagle is a very, very good metaphor for God's careful protection of the people. Among the things that are happening here through the use of this particular bird and the intensification of God's protection is to make the imperative to obey God's commandments all the more important. God didn't just carry you through the wilderness. God protected you on his back. Therefore, when God says, "Honor your father and mother," you're to take that seriously because of what God went out of God's way to do for you. Something like that? Verse 4 again. "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to me. Now then, if you will obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. Indeed, all the earth is mine. See how amazing that sentence is, really? You have seen what I did to the Egyptians. I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to them. Now then, if you will obey me faithfully. So, there is now a condition for what will ensue from that condition. If you will obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, then you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. Okay? So God is singling the Israelites out, not exclusively for glory. You are inherently my treasured possession. I'm giving you a chance to rise to that level through obedience. If you will follow my commandments and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. So, I mean, doesn't this kind of give a context to the whole notion of the chosen people? Chosen for certain opportunities, certain obligations, but not chosen as inherently anything. You're no greater than anybody else. I'm giving you an opportunity to rise high. Indeed, all the earth is mine. Again, I mean, what's that based on? It's based on God's creation of the world. So here, the notion of God's creating the world also becomes a condition for something. God's right to make a claim like this. You'll be my treasured possession if you obey the commandments. And I can say this to you because I created the world. All the earth is mine. Okay? So when we think about the backdrop of this moment of Sinai, it does reach back to earlier passages and claims. But you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So I should read Sarna on this as well. So let me go back to my treasured possession. So the Hebrew segulah, like its Akkadian cognate, originally denoted valued property to which one has an exclusive right of possession. It has this literal meaning in Ecclesiastes and some rabbinic texts. It came to be employed in a figurative sense in theological and political contexts in the ancient world. And it thus expresses God's special covenantal relationship with Israel and his love for his people. At the same time, those biblical texts, as well as Exodus 19, uniquely emphasize the inextricable association between being God's treasured possession and the pursuit of holiness. Okay? Once again, you have obligations that go along with this claim. Now he's talking about a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. This statement further defines the implications of being God's treasured people. National sovereignty, a kingdom of priests, here expressed by kingdom, is indispensable for the proper fulfillment of Israel's mission. Without it, the nation becomes the passive tool of historical forces beyond its control. Now, Sarna's making a very, very powerful claim here. I wonder if we think it's true. That this notion of a kingdom of priests, Mamlechet Kohanim, implies the necessity for some kind of national independence. Does it imply national independence on a particular piece of land? Or can it also apply to diaspora communities? I don't know the answer to that, You know, there was a movement in the 19th century, just about the time, maybe late 19th, early 20th, championed by Simon Dubnow, who wrote a very long history of the Jewish people, which he called diaspora nationalism. Diaspora nationalism is the claim that one can live anywhere and create some sense of community in its self-regulating, self-governing form as a community within communities. And certainly the Russian Empire was a community of communities. So Dubnow, in a way, was proposing a kind of nationalism other than Zionism. For Zionism, you had to go to a certain place. Herzl, as you might remember, did not have the land of Israel in mind. He just wanted to get the Jews out of the house that was on fire. And he was willing to take them anywhere at first until he was read the Riot Act by the so-called Zionists. Herzl made the Uganda proposal at the 6th Zionist Convention, something like that. And basically was, I'm going to try to buy Uganda, I'm going to try to buy a place because the house of the Jews is burning. And a caucus stormed out of that session, and they renamed themselves the Zionists. There's only one place we can go as Zionists, and that's the land of Israel. So, but Herzl was like the Zionists, so to speak, in that a land was a precondition. We had to be autonomous on a land. Dubnow had the idea that we don't. By the way, the Jewish community in America is an example of diaspora nationalism, isn't it? We are self-governing in many, many ways. Federation, all the agencies. Just think of Cleveland. I mean, we are a kind of nation within a nation. And we do very, very well in America. Let's hope it continues. On and on. So whether or not this kingdom of priests, and Sarna is arguing that it needs to be autonomous, without it, the nation becomes the passive tool of historical forces beyond its control. One sees that as necessitated here because we're about to get a variety of laws and institutions. So in that sense, we are self-governing. But whether or not we need to go to a land, I think is made ambiguous by this particular passage. So let me go on here. So the kingdom of priests idea is a powerful one because it's trying to shape the future of the people. At the same time, Sarna goes on, the priest's place, a kingdom of priests, the priest's place and function within society must serve as the ideal model for Israel's self-understanding of its role among the nations. The priest is set apart by a distinctive way of life, consecrated to the service of God, and dedicated to ministering to the needs of the people. So we have kind of two metaphors here, kingdom and priests, kingdom autonomy, and having the wherewithal to govern ourselves. Priests as a kind of leadership model serving higher ideals for the people. So, you know, Exodus in Hebrew is known as Sefer Shmot, from the first word, second word. Ve'elu Shmot. These are the names of the sons of Jacob and so on. So the name in Hebrew for a biblical book is in some sense accidental. It's the first or second word that comes up. When you think about it, in substantive terms, lots of things are named in the book of Exodus. Moses is named, the manna is named. You remember manna, the people say manhu. What is it? So the manna is a mysterious kind of middle ground between a material substance and a gift from God. Here the Jewish people are named. It's a complex name. It's not one word. What's our name? A kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And that is extremely rich as a description. Bertrand Russell called this kind of thing a definite description. It defines through description something in a unique way. Okay? So once again, something is named here, and in two ways. Am Segulah, a treasured people, and a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Let's go on. These are the words that you shall speak to the children of Israel. Moses came and summoned the elders of the people and put before them all that the Lord had commanded him. All the people answered as one, saying, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Okay? So the people are already saying yes, although God has only made a certain kind of promises here. And Moses brought back the people's words to the Lord. Notice another motif that is at work here, and that is the singularity of Moses. Because Moses will become the lawgiver. And if the lawgiver is exemplary, then that which the lawgiver brings is also exemplary. So the elevation of Moses is also very important here. And we're going to see more of it. And Moses brought back the people's word to the Lord. And the Lord, verse 9, said to Moses, I will come to you in a thick cloud. Notice how adroit these metaphors for God's presence are. A thick cloud is something, but it also conceals, especially if it's thick. So God is not exactly personified here, not exactly seen, but certainly God's presence is made manifest. I will come to you in a thick cloud in order that the people may hear what I speak with you and so trust you ever after. Okay? So God's voice, but also that Moses shall be trusted. And that trust is based upon the people's experience of hearing God command Moses. So the authority of Moses is dependent upon the authority of God to delegate, and God does it in public so that the people themselves can witness it. Then Moses reported the people's words to the Lord, and the Lord said to Moses, go to the people and warn them to stay pure today and tomorrow. Let them wash their clothes. Let them be ready for the third day. So the third day is understood by the rabbis as the 6th of Sivan, Shavuot, the day on which the Torah is given to the people. You've got to have some flexibility of interpretation to get there. And of course, there are two ways to interpret something. You start from the elements and come to a conclusion. Or you start from the conclusion and then try to wrap elements around it. That's what has happened here, I think. Let them be ready. So verse 11, so on and so on. Verse 12. You shall set bounds for the people round about, saying, beware of going up the mountain or touching the border of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall be either stoned or shot. I take it that means no touch shall hand him at that moment, but later on there will be this physical punishment. Beast or man, he shall not live. With the ram's horn, when the ram's horn sounds a long blast, they may go up on the mountain. So, what do we have here? Let's go on a little bit. Moses came down from the mountain to the people and warned the people to stay pure, and they washed their clothes. And he said to the people, be ready for the third day, do not go near a woman. So, what do we have here? What's going on here? Okay, misogyny. Okay, all right. Women are singled out here as to be quarantined off. See? Okay. What else do you feel about this?
This is so momentous, you have to prepare.
Say that again?
Because this is so momentous, you have to prepare for it.
Okay, so there are preparations because of the momentousness of the event. I mean, this is the revelation. This is that on which everything in Judaism, we might say, religious Judaism, depends. And so it's not just treated casually. There are preparations that are necessary. What else do you feel here, Maya?
I think it's to purify your soul, so just to put aside the flesh
Yeah.
for the spirit.
Okay, so the preparation is not only physical, wash your clothes, but also spiritual. And the whole idea of holiness, I think the idea of the holy has two components: separated and elevated. So the holy is to be separated from the profane, but not in the sense that some things are separated from another, but this is also elevated in stature and in content and in value. So holiness requires some separation so that something elevated can emerge, a spiritual experience, right? So precisely these instructions give us kind of the contours of holiness. Separate, elevated. Ron?
Can you analogize the sacredness of the woman to the sacredness of the mountain?
Yeah.
Don't come up on my mountain.
Yeah, okay.
Do not profane me.
Yeah.
Do not be with a woman.
No.
Do not profane her.
Mm.
For she is holy as am I.
Well.
You got that out of this?
Well,
I also talk to my wife.
Now we're getting somewhere.
no, but Ron is making some interesting points here. I mean, there is separation involved for the sake of a higher experience. Don't come up on the mountain because now you're approaching something sacred. I don't know that I would go so far as your inference, but I really like the thought process. I mean, I think Maya's point is also important here, that the needs of the flesh should be put aside here for the sake of something spiritual. I don't know that the Bible loves this duality, flesh and spirit, as much, but I think it's provocative here. Yeah, please.
I think it's almost like as an example of don't get distracted. For example, don't go near a woman.
Good. Yeah. Focus. The preparations, the separation. You're about one thing here.
Don't football players, they're not allowed to sleep with their wives before a game? Right?
Yes.
Well, there is that idea. I don't know to what degree it's enforced. Right. The sense that a sexual experience is also going to sap some of your strength. There's that idea too. Candy?
Well, we would be remiss if we did not discuss the role of women in the Jewish people at this point in the discussion.
Yep.
Because it certainly sounds demeaning, the way it's written.
Okay, so, I mean, Candy, of course, has made an important point and raised an important issue. I would be a little bit loath to draw larger conclusions about biblical religion, about Judaism from this, though this should be taken seriously. I mean, as we know, women play a powerful role in the biblical narrative over and over and over again. So it's what I like to call a counter-narrative to the patriarchal narrative, which I think is there in the Bible. So here you think, Candy, that this is in itself demeaning of women.
Yeah, it puts women into second-class status. You should separate them, put them away someplace. You should not have contact with them. It's considering them impure.
Well, is that true? Let me offer another possibility. That this isn't just about women, it's about the connection between men and women. That women need to be put aside here so that there is no contamination in the sexual relationship between men and women. The sanctity of both sexes is at stake here, but both are altered by this comparison, by this command, aren't they? The woman is singled out, that's for sure. I mean, the author could have said, men, separate yourselves, or something like that. You buy my reinterpretation?
It's a stretch.
You think it's a stretch?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
you're making excuses.
Okay. Jackie?
I think we have to go back in our time. We can't put our values and judgments on what was written then. It was a different time. However, before there is a marriage, the man and the woman are not together. The woman does go and purify herself so that when they do come together, there's an experience that they're sharing with God. But I think we have to think back of not now and put our values, what we think now, back then. It was totally different.
So Jackie is basically making the argument known as historicism, that each generation is equally close to God, is a way of putting it. Each generation has its own values, and no subsequent generation or era can comment or criticize those values because they're true in that society. I think there's something to that, of course. On the other hand, when you're dealing with Scripture, which wants to be true for all time, I think the scriptural ethos is what we're saying is not just relevant for our day, but relevant for all time. So that when you're reading Homer and you have the gods flirting around with one another, Homer is not trying to say to us, this is the idea of the divine that you should embrace for all time. This is this situation, and I'm trying to draw as much wisdom out of it as I can. So I think classical literature is not I could be wrong about that now that I think about it. Maybe fiction. Now I'm getting into deep water. Right. I mean, yeah. Okay. Thucydides, in his preface to his History of the Peloponnesian Wars, says explicitly, I did not write this for the applause of the moment, but as an inheritance for all time. He makes it quite clear that he's not just writing for his own day. This isn't just about one war. This is about war. So, yeah. Can we get away with historicism, which is essentially relativism, that each generation has its rights and wrongs, and they're not normative for other generations? Jackie, you want to follow that up?
Yes, but as each generation reads it, you see how it's written, but it's interpreted in a different way.
Okay.
That's why we're here.
Good. So that softens your idea of historicism a little bit because it suggests that what was true in one era still can resonate in other eras. In other words, it's interpretable and therefore may have meaning for another era, not necessarily the meaning it had then. Sue?
Well, just to back up.
I don't look to my
Where
left
Jackie's
well.
going.
I'm sorry. Yeah. No, I'm often accused of not looking to my left. But, yeah. Roman of blessed memory used to, remember that? Go ahead, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I just think that the way this has been interpreted over the years isn't the way it was said. I think that there's been a lot made of impurity of women that isn't really explicitly said. I think that what he was calling for, or if it were being written today, it would be separate yourself and become more spiritual and less physical.
And not the sense of impurity that this implies.
Well, I don't know that it necessarily even implies it. I think much was made of it down the years.
It's more innocent than we might make of it.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Kathy?
So I see the long shadow.
I'm
I
sorry.
see the long shadow of the Garden of Eden story. You have a place, a space you're not supposed to go to. And you have the tempter, you have the female in the role of tempting with that space. So aren't we sort of going back around to sort of the, some original storytelling ideas?
What I really like about your comment, I think, is something about the cultural mood of that time, which may think of women as more second class.
I think just
Women
because
have
they're storytelling. I don't know that maybe they got that deep into it, but they had a creation story of the people. And this is sort of, to me, just sort of
a
revisiting that again.
continuation. So
Because they
it's,
don't make a big deal of it. They don't go on about anything.
yeah, but it's kind of a thread, you're saying, that weaves itself through this literature. But it's a provocative comment. I wonder whether Eve is a temptress. I mean, she says to Adam, eat, well, and puts up no fuss at all. We're not supposed to do it. He goes right for it. Jordan. Okay. Oh, you were waving on behalf of others. Very good. Okay. Who should I call on that? Maya.
I thought that this is maybe not so much about the woman or the people, but this is exploring the identity of God. Who is God? Because now we see that he is like an eagle, and then he's coming in a cloud. And I think that, like in Greek mythology, what you read is to worship the god, you have a sexual orgy, Dionysus and all those. So I think that here it tries to differentiate that the Jewish God or the Hebrew God is something that you approach spiritually and not carnally or whatever. So I think that maybe we should shift the argument to this is a new entity, comes in the desert, gives them man. Who is he? And I think that maybe that's what.
So you're suggesting, let me see if I understand you correctly, that this description of the circumstances and what to do and not to do is for the sake of the elevation of the God who is, in a way, displaying God's self here in new ways. Yeah, I like that. I like that. Some of you have probably read Rudolf Otto's great book, The Idea of the Holy. And Otto defines the holy as mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the dangerous and fascinating holy. It draws us to it, but it also repels us. Don't take your shoes off, you're on holy ground. The seductiveness, the magnetism of the holy, but also the danger. And so that has something to do with the mood. I mean, this is a very emotional description of God, right? Not as lawgiver, but as a mysterious and fascinating and dangerous presence who now, and part of it is once again, the elevation of the dignity, the power of God to command. I don't want to reduce all of this just to one idea, but that's part of what is going on here. As God is going to ask the people to do certain things or else in a certain way So it's developing. Okay, so good. Nice discussion about that. Let's go on a little bit. Verse 16. Sorry?
Jordan wanted to talk.
No, Jordan was just pointing to you guys. Okay, verse 16. On the third day, as morning dawned, there was thunder and lightning, so once again, and a dense cloud upon the mountain, and a very loud blast of the horn. It's the shofar. Moses led the people out of the camp toward God, and they took their places at the foot of the mountain. Now, Mount Sinai was all in smoke, for the Lord had come down upon it in fire. Think of the spectacle here. The smoke rose like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled violently. The blare of the horn grew louder and louder. And as Moses spoke, God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. Once again, the singularity of Moses, who is going to have this kind of one-on-one with God. The Lord said to Moses, "Go down, warn the people not to break through to the Lord to gaze, lest many of them perish." Dangerous holiness. The priests also who come near to the Lord must stay pure, lest the Lord break out against them. But Moses said to the Lord, "The people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you warned us, saying, 'Set the bounds about the mountain and sanctify it.' So the Lord said to him, 'Go down, come back together with Aaron, but let not the priests or the people break through to come up to the Lord, lest he break out against them.' And Moses went down to the people and spoke to them." Okay? So, the context, the spectacle, Moses singled out from the people. The people, in some sense, at least as the implication, are frightened by this spectacle and its power. That continues. Let's just go ahead to chapter 20, verse 15. This is after the Ten Commandments. 20, verse 15. All the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the blare of the horn, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they fell back and stood at a distance. "You speak to us," they said to Moses, "and we will obey. But let not God speak to us, lest we die." Moses answered the people, "Be not afraid, for God has come only in order to test you, and in order that the fear of him may be ever with you, so that you do not go astray." So the people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick cloud where God was. These verses may very well be out of place. They look like they're a continuation of chapter 19. But in a certain way, there's an envelope here. The people, Moses, the people. The people are afraid. Moses goes up. The people are afraid. And in their trepidation, they say to Moses, "You speak for us, and we will stand at a distance." So this is what we might call the second commissioning of Moses. Moses is first commissioned by God to be the leader of the people. But here the people are commissioning Moses to be their leader. Okay? It's one thing to be commissioned from above. Let's just think of clergy. So I was ordained by a rabbinical school. That's my commission. So I come to a congregation. Nobody wants to listen to me. So, hey, I've been ordained as a rabbi. It doesn't matter if the people aren't willing to accord some authority, let's put it, small a, so a leader needs to be commissioned both, let's call it, from above and from below. And here's the from below. So the author, I think, is very acutely aware of the need in an unmistakable way to give Moses the authority to bring down the commandments from God and to lead the people in the wilderness, come thick or thin. So Moses' stature is greatly at stake here. So let's go back to chapter 20. Yes, Ben?
Moses had that way before in Egypt. He was the ambassador of God to the pharaohs and so on, and he would led the people out. I mean, this is not a new role at all for him, and the people were following him prior to this. I don't disagree with what you're saying, but I think it's not a new position for him.
I think it's an awfully good point. In chapter 5, I don't know if I can find it right away, the people do, just at the beginning of Moses' journey to Pharaoh, chapter 5, verse 19. Now this is way at the beginning. Now the foremen of the Israelites found themselves in trouble because of the order. You must not reduce your daily quantity of bricks. And as they left Pharaoh's presence, they came upon Moses and Aaron standing in their path. They said to them, "May the Lord look upon you and punish you for making us loathsome to Pharaoh and to his courtiers, putting a sword in their hands to slay us." And Moses returned to God and said, "Lord, why did you bring harm upon this people? Why did you send me ever since I came to Pharaoh?" So, yes, he's commissioned as their leader, but I might say it's fragile leadership, subject to circumstances, so it very well may need reinforcement over and over again. That's not consistent with what you're saying. As a matter of fact, I think your comment makes richer the whole question of leadership. That it's not, it's not just that you're the leader and now for all time everybody's going to follow you, just depending on how well you do your job and what the people need at a certain point in time. So I kind of like that idea of the fragileness of leadership, especially in fraught circumstances. Barbara?
I think what's so interesting is how Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, tells him to give the people more power to decide their own fate. And he's not even part of the religion.
That's very good. Yeah.
He's outside of it.
So back to chapter 18, where Jethro is, this is your point, empowering the people as well. Here the people are in a much reduced status, right? They're afraid, they can't go near the mountain, and so on and so on. Not only for its own sake, the danger of being too close to the holy, but to elevate Moses. And what you're suggesting, Barbara, is a kind of complement, C-O-M-P-L-E, to this idea. Chapter 19 and 20, Moses alone. There's a novel by one of my former teachers, Samuel Sandmel, maybe some of you know that name, Alone Upon the Mountaintop. So that's the idea of Moses alone carrying the burden. Whereas chapter 18 in Jethro is very different. You can't do it all. The people are also capable. And not only is there a different view of the relationship between people and Moses, but it's delivered, this piece of wisdom, by a foreign priest, which is quite astonishing for biblical literature. I mean, maybe at this particular moment, that wisdom, we're about to get the wisdom from God. And just a few chapters before, it comes from a foreigner. Yeah, Jim?
Well, but Jethro was not just a foreigner, he was a seasoned politician.
Okay.
Very much so, and he wasn't exactly a foreigner. He was the grandfather of Moses' children.
Yeah, that's right.
So it wasn't like somebody they didn't know.
Very good.
But he was, I think he introduced politics to Moses in that, okay, you're the leader, but there's a way to say it and a way not to say it. To get a consensus here.
I like that. So Jethro, Jim is suggesting that Jethro is both intimate, he's Moses' father-in-law, and as you, I think, more poignantly put it, the grandfather of their children. But he also has something to do with politics, which I define as interest in power. Who gets it? How is it distributed? How is it justified? And Jethro has a view about power, that it needs to be distributed. Others need to take responsibility for the well-being of the community, not only so that Moses doesn't get exhausted by 8:30 in the morning, but so that the people take some responsibility. There's some ownership that comes along with responsibility. I like that. Later on in the book of Numbers, when the people are at long last moving away from Sinai, Numbers chapter 11, somewhere like that, Moses asks Jethro, who now is called by another of his four names, Chovav maybe, come with us. We're about to go to the promised land. So Jethro is still there through all of this. And finally Jethro says, no, I'm going to go back to my own land. Chapter 10, chapter 11, chapter 10, verse 29 of Numbers. Moses said to Chovav, the son of Reuel the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law. So Jethro has all of these different names. We're not sure it's the same person, but there's a kind of an alignment here. We are setting out for the place of which the Lord has said, I will give it to you. Come with us, and we'll be generous with you, for the Lord has promised, be generous to you. I will not go, Jethro replied, but will return to my native land. He said, please don't leave us, inasmuch as you know where we should camp in the wilderness can be our guide. You still have something to teach us. That's your point, Jim. So that if you come with us, we will extend to you the same bounty. But evidently, Jethro returns home. But he's still with the people. I mean, so that Jethro is an important figure among these people, but finally decides to return to his people. Michael?
If you will allow me, I would like to go back to the story, explanation of purity and contamination.
Good.
Which is absolutely wrong, as a number of people mentioned. Well, it shows that God recognized vulnerability and the power of the women. Vulnerability is going back to the story of Eve.
Oh, okay.
That she was influenced very easily by serpent, and the power is the rest of the history, that women can be very powerful, inspiring men for the great deeds and not so great. And if we will go to modern literature, Merchant of Venus, how well demonstrated power and wisdom of women to overpower women.
So your point here is that the imperative to separate yourself from the women is to separate yourselves from some special power that women have so that you can focus on the revelation?
No, not only this, but my point is that God at the earliest stage indicated that he recognized woman as a very powerful opposition that he has to reckon with.
Okay. We've already seen a lot of it in Genesis and Exodus, but here it's made maybe more explicit. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I happened to write my rabbinic thesis on, the title was The Power of Women, and the male response of envy and something else. Yeah, no, it's a powerful idea, that's for sure.
Can we read it?
I burned it. Yeah, if you want to read it, I haven't looked at it in a long time, but sure. Ron?
At the risk of bringing down the wrath of most of the room, we have to remember and go all the way back to the beginning of Genesis, that it was a woman, who screwed things up initially.
Well,
Excuse me?
I think, Ron, your allusion to wrath. Yeah, but Adam goes along with it immediately, and he's the one who makes excuses and so on. I'm not sure that there's a wonderful essay, we've looked at it before by what's her name? Who?
Phyllis.
Yes, Phyllis Tribble, right. What's the name of it? A Love Story Gone Awry. And she takes on this issue of that the women were really kind of the problem here. I mean, it's a very interesting and extensive, close reading of the text. Worth reading. Yeah. They're both punished together and so on. Jackie?
Yeah, when you think about it, let's start from the basics. It's the woman who gives birth. If it weren't for the woman, none of us would be here. Forget about the guy, okay? She is the one historically who have raised the house, who have kept the home, cooked the food, cleaned the laundry, and has helped men succeed.
Would you like to come up here?
No, I'll be right here on my soapbox. And has helped men succeed and reach their, their
Pinnacle.
The pinnacle. You are on a roll. Yeah.
Having raised and lived in a home with 4 women.
You agree?
Yeah.
I agree with you.
There is this notion, by the way, of parthenogenesis, where women can give birth without men. The subtitle of my rabbinic thesis was "And Male Envy as a Response." The whole the circumcision chapter in Genesis 17 is all about 2 men, so it is male figures working together. I mean, after all, the woman has just given birth, but she's totally out of the circumcision story, the first covenant. So I've tried to fashion that in my thesis as some of these stories are a product of male envy of women and their more natural role. Women's cycles, menstrual cycles, corresponding parallel to the cycles of the moon. We men are in no way natural the way women are, and the women are the portal to life and so on. So it's kind of the argument that I wanted to make in that thesis. Candy.
Well, of course, I'm very sympathetic to the things that you're saying, and they're very convincing, I think. But the problem that I have with what's going on here is, and I only mention this because I don't know if you're aware of it or not, is the evil cast that you give to women by the things that you're saying. You say there's something inherently evil in their spirit. And, you know, Jackie's pointing out a positive, life-giving naturalness of women.
It can also be sociological too. After all, I mean,
I realize that.
the women, the male role in whose progeny it is a rumor. The men's role, the women's role is a certitude, and in that sense, if you want to have some sense of the whole issue of inheritance and the continuing of the line, and you want that to be authentic, we have to be sure, I might say, sociologically understood without prejudice, that the women need to be separated to some degree in more traditional societies, so we know whose child it is, so we know in terms of and so on. So I think some of the customs that have arisen over the centuries have something to do with social inheritance factors and not just prejudice against a certain sex. It's a big topic, obviously, but you know, there are a variety of factors that have gone into this. Anyhow, I'm so glad the time is up.
Can I rephrase? I did not accuse women of being evil.
Okay.
Repeat what I said.
Okay.
Vulnerable but powerful.
And I go back to my first comment, women were sacred.
So, look, I mean, we've looked at some very powerful moment in biblical history, which has been totally obscured. by this conversation. I'll see you all next week. Shabbat Shalom.
I committed the sin of believing where the circumcision become mandate.
Chapter 17
Of Genesis 17.
You should circumcise your sons, and Abraham sacrificed circumcises himself.
So those were the original covenants. Well, that's the those rules were never reincorporated in the commandments. Circumcision rules.
Okay. What do you mean? What do you say? By focus on the rules rather than the circumcision. It is one. I get that.
No, the rules. All of the rules of social conduct are set forth in the commandments.
Okay.
But it never reiterates
Doesn't come back.
the original covenant.
I'm not sure you're right.
Well, I don't know. That's what I'm asking.
Well, I don't know either. I mean, Wikipedia would know right away. Where is the circumcision?
Well, it originates in Genesis.
Definitely Genesis. But doesn't come back.
It doesn't come back
In the Sinai.
in the Sinai codes.
I'm sure it does. I'll look it up.
Yeah, it was of interest to me because of an article that I read over the weekend, very more about the affirmation practice where non-Jew or half-Jew male wants to become a whole Jew. He has to go to mikvah. But before he goes to mikvah, there's got to be a drop of blood. And I'm thinking to myself, where does this come from?
Rabbis, I'm sure, who are not requiring full circumcision, but just a symbolic circumcision by blood.
From the
I did a conversion once where a man who was converted said to me, I wanted to like my son. So I went down to the hospital to be with him and his family. That's a big procedure. It's a big procedure. Yeah. But generally just a drop of blood. Hatafat dam breed it's called.
I believe those were the words that were used in the article I was reading. Interesting.
Oh, that's very good. And that's a good example of interpretation. It's just too much to ask of a grown man to go through this procedure. So let's do it symbolically so we accomplish it in some way. We're not
In this particular case, the guy had a Jewish father and Gentile mother, but he had a medical circumcision, not a rabbinic.
He had already been circumcised.
Right.
So he couldn't go through it again. The person I'm talking about.
Could have gone through it again. When they do this affirmation in an uncircumcised male, they don't require circumcision. Or do they?
Who's they?
Whomever is dictating the rules.
I don't require circumcision at all.
What about super Orthodox?
Oh, definitely. There is something either real, either whole or part with the drop. They're going to require it. And mikveh as well. I don't require mikveh. Though I think I do have, that's interesting, though, I do have females. Yeah. I'm basically, I don't do a lot of conversions, but I'll have to think about that, whether that's what I do.
Some prayers that the male, have to say.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Same, yeah. Always great. Say hi to Marty for me.
And all the women.
This is my brother Jonathan.
Hi, Jonathan. Nice to meet you. Good to meet you. Thank you. Good to have you.
Appreciated your talk last night. And I'm impressed with your ability to amalgamate so many things that seem disparate, but somehow you get them together.
My mind just, there's a Dostoevsky.
Yes.
Now, what do you do and where do you live?
I live in Syracuse, New York, and I'm retired as a psychiatric social.
In Syracuse?
Yes.
Nice. So some of what I talked about last night are your cup of tea.
Yes, absolutely.
Human fallibility.
Also, being in the now ACC, I'm very familiar with Coach K.
Oh, yeah, I see what you mean. A fabled guy.
Yeah.
Who was the UCLA coach? John Wooden. I think he had something like 13 championships. Coach K made a second.
You threw out that name, and he was like that on top of it. Everybody else was sort of around us, and he was the coach at Duke. He said immediately.
Oh, down last night? Yeah. Oh, nice. Very good. Yeah. And thank God we don't have to pronounce KRZYZ.
Right.
Yeah. So you're visiting for a while?
Yeah.
Sure.
Just another day or two.
Are you the only siblings?
Yes.
It's really
Well, Lena is very precious to us, that's for sure.
He's one of a kind.
She took care of Maury during a very difficult period. You knew Maury?
Yep.
Yeah, you were the one who was with him at the end.
Yes, I'm the one who said to him, I called everybody, I don't think I called you, but I called everybody and put the phone by his ears, even though he wasn't conscious or didn't seem to be. And everybody told him what they thought, sent him love and whatever. And as I left, I said to him, Wendy's waiting. Everybody left you, and I went through all the names that I talked to him. And I said, you're Rachel and I, Rachel's my daughter. Rachel and I said, you are loved, you are loved, whatever I said. And I walked out, and by the time I got to the car, she called me and said, it was like that, it was like giving permission, I didn't realize it.
Sense of well-being. Our impulse is survival.
Right.
But at the end, when our body is telling us something, maybe our minds and our hearts come along.
And everybody said, when they felt they gave it their love, and I reiterated that at the last, and it was amazing. I didn't realize that would have that impact. Gone, just gone. It was amazing. Anyway, thank you for every one of these sessions.
Oh, good. They're spirited, aren't they? They are. It always reminds me of Richard Strauss's theory of conducting. You know Strauss, they get up in front of the orchestra and stay out of their way.
That's right.
Throw a bomb into the center and then
Let 'em
walk
go.
back.
And my daughter Rachel has said that if she lived in Cleveland, she would be here Saturday.
Oh, good. When she's here, she'll come.
She does.
You'll come back.
I definitely will.
Yeah, no, it's very rich. You know, it's what's amazing over here is how unbelievable the Bible is. I mean, it gets a bad name because, you people, religious people and so on. It's a wise word. And that's why Maimonides said, by the way, that Moses said knowledge and wisdom. That Maimonides, that Moses had no use for the fact that he was fantasizing.
He was told what to do.
Moses?
Yeah, he was told what to do.
Well, Maimonides' view is that Moses understood, he had some sort of intellectual connection with God. The meaning of all this, the wisest man who ever lived. The medieval solution of the active, the agent intellect, which may be a cosmic force, which our intellects can conjoin with at the upper reaches of our understanding. And Maimonides says that Moses became an angel in that sense.